Pokeberries by Ruth Stone. I started out in the Virginia mountains with my grandma's pansy bed and my Aunt Maud's dandelion wine. We lived on greens and back fat and biscuits. My Aunt Maud scrubbed right through the linoleum. My daddy was a northerner who played drums and chewed tobacco and gambled. He married my mama on the rebound. Who would want an ignorant hill girl with red hair? They took a Pullman up to Indianapolis, and someone stole my daddy's wallet. My whole life has been stained with pokeberries. No man seemed right for me. I was awkward until I found a good wood-burning stove. There is no use asking what it means. With my first piece of ready cash, I bought my own place in Vermont. Kerosene lamps, dirt road. I'm sticking here like a porcupine up a tree. Like the one our neighbor shot, its bones and skin hung there for 3 years in the orchard. No amount of knowledge can shake my grandma out of me, or my Aunt Maud, or my mama, who didn't just bite an apple with her big white teeth. She split it in two. So, Ruth Stone was born in rural Roanoke, Virginia, on June 8, 1915. She married Walter Stone, a professor, and together they had 3 daughters. Unfortunately, Walter ended his own life in 1959 and left Ruth alone to care for the children. Miss Stone traveled to many universities around the country, teaching poetry, English, and creative writing. She ended up in Ripton, Vermont. This is her house pictured, where she later died on November 19, 2011. She was 96 years old. Ruth Stone had an incredibly unique creative process, which is best described by Elizabeth Gilbert, the author of the bestseller Eat, Pray, Love, in her TED Talk about creative genius. Mrs. Gilbert describes her interaction with Ruth.
I had this encounter recently where I met the extraordinary American poet Ruth Stone, who's now in her 90s, but she's been a poet her entire life, and she told me that when she was growing up in rural Virginia, she would be out working in the fields, and she said she would feel and hear a poem coming at her from over the landscape, and she said it was like a thunderous train of air, and it would come barreling down at her over the landscape, and when she felt it coming, because it would shake the earth under her feet, she knew that she had only one thing to do at that point, and that was to, in her words, run like hell. And she would run like hell to the house, and she'd be getting chased by this poem, and the whole deal was that she had to get to a piece of paper and a pencil fast enough so that when it thundered through her, she could collect it and grab it on the page. And other times she wouldn't be fast enough, so she'd be running and running and running, and she wouldn't get to the house, and the poem would barrel through her, and she would miss it. And she said it would continue on across the landscape, looking, as she put it, for another poet. And then there were these times. This is the piece I never forgot. She said that there were moments when she would almost miss it, right? So she's running into the house and she's looking for the paper, and the poem passes through her, and she grabs a pencil just as it's going through her, and then she said it was she would reach out with her other hand and she would catch it. She would catch the poem by its tail, and she would pull it backwards into her body as she was transcribing on the page. And in these instances, the poem would come up on the page perfect and intact, but backwards from the last word to the first.
So in this poem, Pokeberries by Ruth Stone, we're introduced to her personal universe, in which you don't really need a man to succeed, to survive, or even to be happy in life. She shows the reader all of the independent women in her life, and how they've impacted her and how they've taught her. And she also shows us how men have sort of let her down, especially in this poem, her father. She doesn't describe him as the best guy, and then we know from my research that, her husband committed suicide early in life, and he left her to sort of fend for herself and take care of the children, and it was sort of a selfish act. So I think in this poem, we see how men have sort of let Ruth down in her life. And so I think feminism really shines through in this poem, and I think that's her main goal, is to show that it's the women in her life that have truly impacted her and taught her the values that she has upheld and taught her children throughout her life. It's really interesting that this poem is only one stanza, because the poem has exactly 23 lines, and the 12th line, so the very middle line, is that line, "My whole life has been stained with pokeberries," this one right here. And this line that includes the title divides the entire poem. The first 11 lines describe Stone's childhood and her background and the people that have helped raise her, especially her Aunt Maud and her grandma and her mama, and even her daddy a little bit. And then she switches in the next 11 lines where she describes herself as an independent adult, but she still remembers and honors what she's learned from the strong women in her life. I started out in the Virginia mountains, so we know right off the bat that this is a rural setting, with my grandma's pansy bed and my Aunt Maud's dandelion wine. So immediately she's showing us the resourcefulness of the women in her life, like her grandma with her pansy bed and her Aunt Maud making wine from dandelions. And we also see that these are things that have been passed down generationally from these women in her life. And we see right off the bat this link between this sort of more modern version of Ruth Stone, who's writing this sort of looking back. We see this link between her and, things that have been passed down generationally from her grandma and her Aunt Maud, who are these powerful, independent women in her life. We lived on greens and back fat and biscuits. My Aunt Maud scrubbed right through the linoleum. So not only is this line, "we lived on greens and back fat and biscuits," not only is that incredibly detailed and adding to the already detailed introduction, but we also see again this resourcefulness that's been handed down generationally from these women in her life. And the second line, "my Aunt Maud scrubbed right through the linoleum." I was confused by this at first, and I didn't really understand what this could mean. But then I thought about it, and I think that this is showing the work ethic that was instilled in Ruth at a very young age, from her Aunt Maud especially, who worked so hard, as it says here, that she scrubbed right through the linoleum. So it's sort of a play on words to show what a hard worker, or what hard workers these women were. My daddy was a northerner who played drums and chewed tobacco and gambled. He married my mama on the rebound. Who would want an ignorant hill girl with red hair? So this is an interesting 4-line part of the poem, because not only is it showing the contrast between her mother and her father. Her father was, a northerner, and he was kind of wild, and he gambled. And then there's her mom, who he sort of married on the rebound, and she's an ignorant hill girl with red hair. So that's sort of showing, her innocence, and there's this contrast between the two. But I think this is also trying to show, her mother is obviously from the South, and she's marrying this northerner who gambles and chews tobacco and is, and so I think it's kind of also highlighting her mother's independence, because I'm sure she got a lot of skepticism from people in her town and maybe even people in her family, but she made an independent decision, and she didn't care what other people thought. So again, this is highlighting, this independence that's been instilled in this family of women, for generations. They took a Pullman up to Indianapolis, and someone stole my daddy's wallet. So basically what she's saying is her mother and father ran away together, to the north, obviously, and basically her father, got involved in gambling or some other type of trouble, and he lost all of his money. And again, this ends the childhood and background knowledge portion of the poem, and sort of propels us into her adult life after the middle line, which talks about pokeberries. My whole life has been stained with pokeberries. So again, this is the 12th line in the exact middle of the poem. And basically what she's saying here is that her life, it hasn't been perfect and it's been kind of awkward. And I think the fact that she's using pokeberries as opposed to, anything else like ink or bleach or something is to reiterate that sort of natural, rural, sort of rustic feeling that we get from this poem. And it also goes back to the pansy bed and the dandelion wine, again, highlighting those natural resources that are highlighted and passed down generationally from these women. So everything pretty much, especially this part, has gone back to the women. No man seemed right for me. I was awkward until I found a good wood-burning stove. So that's sort of highlighting this idea of domesticity. There's no use asking what it means, but we kind of know, don't we? Because we know that she feels most comfortable in a rustic, rural setting. And we know this from what we've learned and the knowledge we've gained from the context of the first part of the poem. With my first piece of ready cash, I bought my own place in Vermont. Kerosene lamps, dirt road. So this is highlighting her independence and her wanting to do it herself. And this also goes back to her dad losing all of his money. And the fact that just doesn't really and hasn't really impacted her life at all. Because she wants to work for what she has and what she gets. And what she wants is this rustic Vermont lifestyle, which she achieved, and she has achieved, on her own terms and by her own means. I'm sticking here like a porcupine up a tree, so she is never leaving. Like the one our neighbor shot, its bones and skin hung for 3 years in the orchard. I really, really love this image. She's so attached to this place and she loves this place so much. And the fact that she is using this imagery and this, this example just is reiterating that underlying rustic feel of the entire poem. Going back to her roots and highlighting the things that have been passed down to her from the generations before her. No amount of knowledge can shake my grandma out of me. So no matter how much she grows intellectually, she'll always value the rustic nature of things. Or my Aunt Maud, or my mama, who didn't just bite an apple with her big white teeth. She split it in two. This reference to Eve in the original sin shows again that her mama didn't care about what society was telling her to do. She went off and married a northerner and rebelled against skepticism and disregarded disappointment. This is the independent spirit that lived and thrived in Ruth Stone until her very last breath. The Stone women are not afraid to take charge and live independently. This last line is the culmination of Ruth Stone's personal universe.